After we've taken to the road with William Woolard.
Walk into any motor museum in the world, you'll be surrounded by dozens of fascinating cars, each with some unique quality to justify its place. Its curiosity value, perhaps, or nostalgia, or just plain desirability. But these cherished and highly polished exhibits are, of course, just a tiny fraction of the 4,000 or so different makes and countless different models made over the past 100 years. And perhaps the ones in the museums aren't really the most significant vehicles in the history of car design anyway. So which are the best? Which cars will be worthy enough to represent each of the 9 decades of this century? Well, on Top Gear, we made just such a selection. We went particularly for family cars, and we road tested each car to see how it matched up to the modern motorists' expectations.
This is the most famous outcome of the historic meeting between Henry Royce, the dour Manchester-based engineer, perfectionist about all things mechanical, and the Honourable Charles Rolls, the London aristocrat who became one of the earliest top car salesmen. Rolls saw the market for a refined and commodious motor carriage. Royce translated that idea into mechanical perfection. Well, you can see the Silver Ghost is a big car. Well, it had to be, because in Edwardian times, the motorist would travel not only with his family, but probably a footman and a maid as well. And the previous 30 brake horsepower Rolls-Royce wasn't really man enough for that job. So in 1906, Henry Royce devised this 6-cylinder, 7-litre engine developing 48 brake horsepower. Unusually, it was built with the cylinders in 2 blocks of 3, as you can see, with 2 plugs per cylinder, and the side valve gear exposed under here, so that routine maintenance was easy. The particular advances in this engine are the resilient mountings at the front. In 1907, most car makers simply bolted their power units direct to the chassis. A 7-bearing crankshaft, a forced lubrication system to the crank and big ends, and the twin-jet Royce carburettor. No Spirit of Ecstasy mascot on this car. They didn't start till 1911. And you notice the RR badge is in red. It changed to black in 1933, but that was not, as some say, in mourning for Sir Henry Royce, although he did die that year. It's interesting to look at Henry Royce's rear suspension for the Ghost. It has half ellipticals each side and another one mounted inversely across the chassis. Well, it looks very clever, but in fact it was soon dropped because the passengers complained it made the car sway too much. So even Henry Royce didn't get it right first time, every time. Let's see how the car goes on the road. I think the thing that amazes me most about this car is the incredible smoothness of it, considering it's a car built 80 years ago. The engine now in direct surge just purrs along, and there's a great smoothness that comes with a big 6-cylinder. And you can imagine the Edwardians just bowling along the country lanes and really enjoying their pioneer motoring. The seats are comfortable, the steering's a bit heavy, the brakes aren't as good as modern cars, of course. But for all that, it still feels a remarkable achievement for a car built so early in the history of the motor car. It's a wonderfully commanding point of view you have up here, because you sit high off the road, you can see over the hedges, you can see exactly what's happening. And once the car's rolling, the heaviness goes out of the steering and it just bowls along. You can understand why all the Edwardians went crazy about this car, and particularly the people at Autocar who wrote such marvellous things about it when they tested this very car back in 1907. At whatever speed this car is driven on its direct third gear, there is no engine as far as sensation goes, nor are one's auditory nerves troubled by a fuller sound than emanates from an 8-day clock.
This is the famous Model T Ford, the Tin Lizzie beloved of the American backwoods, the car that brought freedom of movement to the world. In a production run only 1 year shorter than the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, over 15 million examples were built between 1909 and 1927. At one stage, over half the cars in the world were Model T Fords. So why did the Model T succeed so dramatically over the 2,000 makes of car around when it burst on the motoring scene? The key was the introduction by Ford of the assembly line system. The benefit, over its life, the price came tumbling down from $825 in 1909 to $260 by the mid-20s. And those low prices brought the Model T within the reach of America's heartland farmers, where Henry Ford had his roots. Of course, the other element of the Model T's success was its engineering. Henry Ford had imported vanadium steel from Europe for this car, and he made it lighter and tougher than anything else on offer on the US market. The chassis, well, that was very durable, very strong, but very flexible, and that meant it could twist over the ruts and bumps of farmland America. The suspension, well, that was basic in the extreme. Transverse leaf springs, front and rear, and no dampers. The wheels, well, they were simple artillery wheels. At first, they were non-detachable, and that meant if you got a puncture, you had a tremendous job trying to get the inner tube out and repair it and put it back on without getting the wheel off the car. The gearbox, that was the father of the automatic, a two-speed epicyclic, and the engine, well, that really set the style for all modern engines to come. Up to now, engines have been made with separate cylinders, which were then bolted together on the crankcase. But for the Model T, Henry Ford came up with all four cylinders cast in one cylinder block with a detachable bolt-on cylinder head. And that's the way engines have been pretty much ever since. No electric self-starter on this model. For that, you relied on the good old starting handle. From cold, pull out the choke, turn it over 4 times to prime it, and away she went. So what's the Model T like to drive? Well, in the first place, the majority of people who brought these cars had never driven before, so they didn't know what to expect. But for someone used to a conventional car, it's a nightmare. There's nothing where you expect it to be. There's no accelerator pedal. The throttle works on this quadrant. What you think should be the accelerator pedal is the brake pedal. What you think is the brake pedal selects reverse. And what you think is the clutch selects first and second on the epicyclic. And what you think should be the handbrake, in fact, works the clutch as well. But once you've got it all sorted out, the Model T rolls along really well. There's very solid springs which you can feel and no damping, but on these surface roads, the ride's not bad at all. When you think the car was designed to cope with the ruts and bumps of unsurfaced roads in 1909 America, it's amazingly good today.
For the 20s, there can be only one car of the decade, the Austin 7, a car claimed to have changed the face of motoring for all time. In the 17 years after it was launched in 1922, nearly 300,000 were produced, and the car was arguably the basis for the first Jaguar and Jensen and the first Datsun and BMW.
Lickey Grange, just south of Birmingham, was once the home of Sir Herbert Austin, and it's here that the Austin 7 was designed. Story has it that the first rough sketches were drawn up on the billiard table. It was a crucial car for Sir Herbert. His company was in serious financial difficulties after the First World War, and this little car was to revive its fortunes. He designed it to replace the motorcycle and sidecar. It was a very easy little car to drive, the first genuine car for the working man, but they had yet to develop the electric self-starter.
Converts from motorcycling could accept the lack of an electric starter, and for that matter, no heater, speedometer, petrol gauge, or powered windscreen wiper. Nor did they seem to mind the bone-shaking ride and the drafty and leaky cockpit. Sir Herbert Austin's fellow directors didn't believe there'd be a market for the little car. It was deliberately no wider than a motorcycle combination, but he overcame their scepticism. He'd tested the early prototypes on the hilly roads between Lickey Grange and Longbridge, still the home of the company that was built on the success of the Austin 7. 4,500 were produced in 1923. A four-seater saloon followed in 1926, and the car was soon being built under licence in France by Rosengart, in Germany by BMW, and in the United States.
It's a very simple car to drive. The pedals are the same as we know them today, instead of the much more complicated system that used to be on the Model T Ford. It's a 3-speed crash gearbox, and there are steering column controls for the ignition, advance and retard, and a hand throttle. It doesn't like traffic much, this car. There's no fan on the engine, and so it tends to overheat. But it's a 750cc engine which pushes out about 10 horsepower at around 2,500 RPM. And that means that it'll rattle you up to speeds of around 50 miles an hour. But the braking isn't so hot. It's cable brakes on all four wheels, but they really don't feel as though they've got a lot of force.
In 1934, Citroën produced a car that was to revolutionise thinking on vehicle design, the traction avant. It was to remain in production for over 23 years. They made over 750,000 of them, and it became an enduring symbol of all things French. Fill up, would you please, Mr. Nye? Thank you very much. This car, with its distinctive grille and its smoothly rounded lines, somehow represents a whole era of French motoring. For years, it seems, French detectives pursued their prey in it. French ministers climbed elegantly out of the back seat in front of the Élysée Palace. It's as French, if you like, as beret and a garlic breath. But its claim to be the car of the 30s doesn't simply rest on its sort of Gallic charm. In a decade that was laden with new ideas for the car, this car was described as a technical sensation. For a start, they dispensed completely with the chassis, and the strength of the car comes entirely in the modern manner from tough steel box sections welded together, in fact, a full monocoque, which made it easy to produce on the American-style mass production line that André Citroën introduced to France, but also made the car much lighter, in fact 25% lighter than contemporary equivalents. Less weight meant sprightly performance and significantly better fuel economy. The suspension was also novel, using torsion bars instead of conventional leaf springs, lighter again and needing no maintenance. The third innovation from the young designer Bertoni was the one that gave the car its name, traction avant. The Citroën was the first mass-produced car to be fitted with front-wheel drive, and for just the same reasons as now, excellent handling and more space inside for passengers and luggage. So, three very radical developments, but they really worked, and this car never lost its appeal. Motoring journalists pre-war wrote about it in glowing terms, and one has to say it really is a delight to drive. The gear shift comes out of the fascia, which is somewhat novel, but you soon get used to it. It's got a beautifully marked gate, synchromesh in second and third, which makes it easy to use, and very forgiving ratios. They used to say about this car that acceptable speeds in top gear were anything between 6 and 60 miles an hour. Not everything works well. The angle of the pedals causes aching ankles, and the steering's very heavy at low speeds. But get the car on the move, and its real character shows through. The wide track, low centre of gravity, and independent suspension make it very stable on corners with not a hint of roll. It hangs on impressively. Indeed, it's a delight to drive.
Falling in love again, never want us to. What am I to do? I can't help it.
More Beetles have been made than any other car. Almost 21 million over the last 52 years, and they're still being built today. It was Hitler who fostered the car's early development. Bypassing the existing German car industry, he chose Ferdinand Porsche to develop one of his designs for a cheap car into the Volkswagen. The engine was rear-mounted with air cooling and horizontally opposed cylinders, and at the front end the torsion bar suspension kept the wheels vertical over the bumps. but only Jeep versions were made during the war, and it was left to the British Army to start car production. Initially, for military use, it was only in 1947 that private deliveries started. And this car, JLT 420, was the first to find its way unofficially into Britain. This 1947 Volkswagen Beetle is virtually identical to the car I learned to drive on. As a teenager in the army just after the war, I had the chance to get behind the wheel, the left-hand drive wheel, of one of the first products off the line at Wolfsburg. And I have to tell you, if you learn to drive on a car with a crash gearbox, minimal power, cable brakes and tail-happy handling, you learn well. Inside the Beetle, you quickly realize just what a clever design it is as a people carrier. Up front here, there's plenty of space for two adults, even very good headroom, even though the space in the back is pretty cramped. Driving the car, the things you notice are the large diameter steering wheel, the very funny pedals sprouting up out of the floor, and the minimal instrumentation. And I think probably most of all, the very small rear window, so that you can't really see what's going on behind you. Early cars came in for criticism, particularly concerning noise, difficult gears, and poor brakes. But the faults were cured, and by 1950, 100,000 had been sold. Of course, the Beetle wasn't only the car of the 40s. It's actually been important in most decades since. In the 50s, it was the first imported car to succeed in America. The engine's reliability gave it highway cruising ability. In the 60s, it became the alternative car for those rebelling against chrome, power, and conspicuous consumption. Most beach buggies were Beetle-based. By the 70s, the Beetle was being sold in over 140 countries and assembled in places as distant as the Philippines and Brazil. In the 80s, although far fewer are made, enthusiasm for Beetles, as shown by this rally of fanatics in Henley, is stronger than ever. With so many enthusiasts lovingly caring for Beetles, the car can never die. If this one's lasted 40 years, the latest models will be going well into the 21st century.
You dream boats, you lovable dream boats. The kisses you gave me set my dreams afloat.
Back in 1955, when the RAF were using proper aeroplanes like this beautiful Pembroke for VIPs and communications, there was a sensation at the Paris Motor Show. The sensation was the launch of the DS-19 Citroën. The looks of the car alone stunned the motoring world. It was the first time aerodynamics had played such a part in the design of a car. Remember, at that time, we were driving around in Austin Somersets, and the looks of the DS-19, the shark profile, the goddess, as it was called, really took the motoring world by storm. From the ground up, it was completely different. It used new materials and new methods. Michelin designed a new tyre for it, the steel-braced X. It was the first time a fiberglass panel had been used in the roof of a mass-production car. And it wasn't just the skin of the car. Underneath, the mechanics were revolutionary as well. Citroën had used hydraulic power to control the steering, the brakes, the gear change, and the clutch. And they also used it for the suspension. A hydraulic accumulator charged spheres, and it made the suspension rise and float across bumps. It set new standards for road holding and ride comfort in the industry. On the road in this 1950s DS, the first thing that strikes you is the ride. The car pumps itself up and it just floats across any surface in a way no car in the 50s could equal, and indeed it's almost up to 1980s standard. The power steering chirrups and chirps away to itself, and the suspension sighs and moans. It's a car that's essentially alive the whole time as you're driving along. The launch euphoria of the DS was not to last. The first cars suffered from terrible problems: collapsed suspension, gear change failure, loss of hydraulics, broken drive shafts and useless starters. Allied to that, the first cars went to special customers who were bitterly disappointed. None of the dealers could fix them, and there were no workshop manuals. But the problems were overcome, and by the end of production, over 1.5 million of these classics had been built.
The Mini was launched in the summer of 1959, and this very car was the first one off the production line. But it wasn't an instant success. Sales were very slow at first, and it wasn't until the arrival of 1960 that people began to realise what a brilliant concept it was, such a big package in such a tiny car.
It was only 10 feet long and little more than 4 feet wide. It had 10-inch wheels right out at the four corners with little overhang. The engine was turned sideways to save space. This was the car that popularised front-wheel drive. It was the first mass-production British car to have it. That gave good road holding and also saved space with no transmission tunnel. Rubber independent suspension was used front and rear for an absorbent ride. The design allowed space for 4 adults to travel inside, and yet the car weighed only 1,300 pounds once the square body completed the package.
But the whole essence of the Mini was one man's personality. Sir Alec Isigonis didn't believe in radios in cars, so there wasn't a provision for one anywhere on the dashboard. It was pretty Spartan anyway, just that one great big instrument. And the rest of the car was really fairly basic. These sliding windows, the pull string to open the doors. But the beauty of that arrangement was it did mean there was space for these great big stowage bins underneath. And that's one of the good things about the Mini. It had a lot of place to put things for such a tiny car.
The joy of the Mini right from the start was how easy it is to drive, with terrific visibility all round, light steering that really tells you what the wheels are doing, and a really sporty, fun feel to it, even though it's such an eminently practical little car. It also feels a completely classless car. From dustman to debutante, anyone would feel at home driving it.
There were some quirky aspects to driving it. This tiny rear-view mirror showed you very little of the road behind. The starting button was positioned right down almost underneath the front seat, had this very long sweeping gear change and the great big steering wheel, but it did give you the feeling of superb road holding with a wheel practically at each corner.
The effect of that is to make the Mini feel really stable on the road. It seems to skit around corners with such verve and enthusiasm that you find yourself smiling with enjoyment at the sheer joie de vivre of it. And that was just one of the elements that made it such a significant little car.
The hot hatchback. But cars like the Golf GTI and the Escort XR3 came after the Alfa Sud. Originally though, the Sud was neither a hatchback nor was it particularly hot. So why should it be chosen? The real reason is that for a car of this size, the handling was superb. People had grown used to the Mini cornering as if it was on rails, but they didn't expect that sort of road holding out of a car the size of the Allegros or the Citroën GSs. The motoring press, they all raved about the road-holding capabilities of the new Alfa Sud. Autocar said it was the best front-wheel drive car yet. And they even went as far as to suggest that other manufacturers got hold of the Alfa Sud as soon as possible to see just how to do the job properly. And lo and behold, 3 years later, Volkswagen came up with the Golf, which was to prove the car to beat in the future. So what was so good about the Alfa Sud handling? Well, the very positive turn-in, belt with a rack and pinion steering, provided very stable cornering with limited body roll, and it was sure-footed all the way. Now we're probably used to this sort of handling, but at that time it set the standards for the future. So, how did they produce such good handling in a car of this size? Well, they started by building a brand new flat 4-cylinder engine and mounting it ahead of the centre line of the front wheels. That meant that the engine could be mounted very low in the chassis, thus providing a very low centre of gravity, which is always sought to provide increased road holding. There was conventional McPherson strut front suspension, and unlike the Mini, there was a beam axle across the rear of the car, firmly located, and also providing a certain amount of rear wheel steering, if you like, almost thought of as a modern concept, but something which rid the car of some of the inherent front wheel drive understeer. So nothing very innovative, everything had been sort of done before, and yet the geometry was very good and the suspension generated excellent cornering forces. So why wasn't the Alfa Sud more successful? Sadly, it was due to poor engineering, making them underpowered and very prone to rust. Alfa Romeo eventually boosted the power and made the car a hatchback, but by then the Golf GTI was firmly established as the car to beat. The Alfa Sud continued into the 80s. By then the trend it had started for hot hatchback saloons to be the car for the young enthusiast. That trend had spelt the end of the mass-produced two-seater sports car. Now the same fun could be had driving a family saloon that was also a practical, everyday car.
When it was launched in 1980, the Quattro took the motoring world by storm. It was turbocharged, and so it had a stunning performance, but more importantly, it had four-wheel drive. In fact, it was the first saloon car to go into general production to offer a reliable and relatively inexpensive four-wheel drive system. So it gave the car a quantum leap in road holding at high speeds, and Audi weren't slow to exploit its competition potential. Between 81 and 84, the Quattro won 22 World Championship rallies and countless other events. It carried Hannu Mikkola and Stig Blomqvist to the World Rally Championship in successive years and gave Audi the Manufacturer's Prize in 1983. It's not going too far to say it transformed the world of rally. Since then, only four-wheel drive cars have won the manufacturer's title. Well, I was given the chance to drive Hannu Mikkola's Audi Sport Quattro, not enough to be refused. 550 brake horsepower, 0 to 100 in 6.5 seconds. Indeed, the power available is phenomenal. Only a four-wheel drive car can really cope with such immense power on a loose surface like this. You can see there's a fair bit of sliding around as the tyres fight for grip. The car feels very stable and sure-footed, even on the low-pressure slick tyres this car is using. And that, of course, is the beauty of the Quattro. It feels so predictable. But put your foot down too hard, and it can still be a real handful. Nowhere near as easy to drive as the experts make it look, and certainly not a car for the faint-hearted. Until the advent of the Quattro, four-wheel drive was largely confined to military and farming vehicles and the like, vehicles in which performance wasn't a major factor. What Audi did with their brilliantly simple design was to make four-wheel drive available to the average road car, because it forced other manufacturers to rethink what they were doing, and there aren't many now that don't offer four-wheel drive for the normal family saloon. Well, that was our selection on Top Gear of the cars of the decade. No doubt a little controversial, perhaps not to everyone's liking. But what about the 90s? Well, I think if I were forced to decide now, I know exactly what I would go for.